Tonight. The sun rose Thursday morning like an indifferent witness, spilling amber light across fire escapes and crumbling brick, illuminating a neighborhood that had already been awake for hours. Carmen Santos lay in her bed, watching shadows retreat from her ceiling, listening to her mother's morning sounds in the kitchen, the hiss of the coffee pot, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of morning prayers in Spanish. Her body still hummed with the memory of Miguel's touch, skin remembering what her mind refused to fully process yet. 12 hours until the warehouse meeting, 20 hours until everything changed. She rose slowly, padding barefoot across worn linoleum to her small vanity, a yard sale find her father had refinished before he died, back when Diego still smiled with his whole face. The mirror reflected a girl she almost didn't recognize, lips slightly swollen from kissing, a faint mark on her collarbone, where Miguel's mouth had pressed urgency into her skin, eyes that held secrets her family could never know. Carmen touched her reflection, feeling the cool glass beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in this moment before the day pulled her toward whatever came next. Her hair hung loose past her shoulders, still tangled from sleep and from Miguel's fingers running through it in the darkness. She reached for her brush, pink plastic with missing bristles, another relic from a simpler time, and began the slow, meditative work of smoothing the tangles. Each stroke was a small act of control in a day that would demand she surrender everything. "Mija, breakfast," her mother called from the kitchen. "Coming, Mommy." But Carmen stayed at the mirror, brush moving through her hair in long, steady strokes. The repetition soothed her, each pass of the bristles a countdown to tonight. She thought about Miguel's face in the moonlight, the way he'd looked at her, like she was something precious, something worth the risk. She thought about Diego's face too, her brother, her betrayer, the boy who'd once carried her on his shoulders through these same streets, now the man who'd weaponized her love to trap someone else. Carmen set down the brush and opened her small makeup bag, another act of rebellion disguised as routine. She didn't wear much, couldn't afford much, but today she traced her eyes with careful liner, darkened her lashes with drugstore mascara, painted her lips a soft coral that reminded her of summer sunsets before everything went wrong. She was making herself pretty for a night that might end in violence, adorning herself for what could be goodbye. The girl in the mirror looked older than 19. She looked ready. Marcus Williams woke to his mother's absence, the apartment silent, except for the street sounds filtering through thin walls. She'd already left for her morning shift at the hospital, her nurse's uniform gone from its hook, her sensible shoes missing from beside the door. He found her note on the kitchen table, same as always. "Breakfast in the fridge. Love you. Make good choices. Make good choices." Marcus almost laughed at the bitter irony. He stood at the kitchen window, drinking instant coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up below, Mrs. Delgado hanging laundry on her fire escape. Old Mr. Chen sweeping the sidewalk in front of his grocery. Kids already out on the stoop, too young to understand that summer wouldn't last forever, that childhood ended when you realized the world didn't care if you lived or died. Marcus pulled out the notebook he'd been keeping, pages now filled with his careful handwriting. Names, locations, patterns, everything they knew about Diego's operation. At the top of today's page, he'd written one word in capital letters, "Tonight." He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Miguel's face at the basketball court, saw the resignation in his friend's eyes, heard him say, "I'm already dead." Marcus had spent the dark hours making lists, checking equipment, running through every possible outcome. Ray would approach from the south, using delivery trucks as cover. Tommy would photograph from the factory roof with his father's Polaroid. Marcus would watch for unexpected arrivals, serve as early warning. It was a plan built on hope and desperation, held together by loyalty that might get them all killed. Marcus showered, letting cold water shock him into alertness. He dressed carefully. Dark jeans, dark shirt, nothing that would catch light or draw attention. He packed a small bag, flashlight, extra film for Tommy's camera, the notebook with everything they knew, a knife he'd borrowed from his mother's kitchen and told himself he wouldn't have to use. 6 weeks until Columbia. 6 weeks until he left this neighborhood forever, escaped to Morningside Heights and dormitories, and a future his mother had sacrificed everything to give him. First, tonight. First, Miguel. Marcus sat at the kitchen table and wrote his mother a letter he hoped she'd never have to read. He told her he loved her, that he was grateful, that if something happened, it wasn't her fault. He told her Colombia had been his father's dream too, that he'd tried to honor that dream while staying loyal to his friends. He told her he was sorry. He sealed the letter in an envelope, tucked it under his mattress, and prayed it would stay there, unread, until he could tear it up himself. Tommy Ritchie woke on Sal's couch in the back room of the diner, morning light cutting through dusty windows, the smell of bacon and coffee drifting in from the kitchen. He'd spent another night avoiding his father, avoiding the apartment that felt more like a trap than a home. Sal hadn't asked questions, just pointed to the couch and thrown him a blanket, understanding what Tommy couldn't say. Sometimes the safest place was anywhere but where you were supposed to be. Tommy sat up, joints stiff from the lumpy couch, knuckles still raw from yesterday's training. Today, those knuckles might have to do more than hit a heavy bag. Tonight, they might have to protect his friends. Might have to fight, might have to prove that all his anger could be channeled into something that mattered. He found Sal in the kitchen, flipping eggs with practiced efficiency. Morning? Sal said without turning around. Hungry? Yeah. Sal slid a plate across the counter, eggs, bacon, toast, and poured coffee into a chipped mug. Big day? Tommy met the old man's eyes and saw understanding, the kind that came from surviving your own version of tonight, your own moment when everything hung in the balance. Something like that. Whatever it is, Sal said, returning to his grill. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to walk away, and sometimes it's knowing when to stand and fight. The trick is telling the difference. Tommy ate slowly, forcing food down a throat tight with anticipation. He thought about his father, drunk and bitter in their apartment. He thought about Marcus, preparing to leave for a future Tommy couldn't imagine. He thought about Miguel, trapped in Diego's web, counting down hours until he had to make a heroin delivery that would seal his fate. And he thought about Ray, the quietest of them all. He'd spent 3 days watching Diego's operation. Who'd convinced Carmen to betray her own brother. Who'd planned this whole desperate gambit that might save Miguel or might get them all killed. After breakfast, Tommy walked to his apartment, moving quietly through streets he'd known his whole life. The Bronx in morning light looked almost innocent. Kids playing stickball, women chatting on stoops, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing as if tonight wasn't coming, as if the world wasn't about to crack open for 4 boys who'd grown up too fast. His father was passed out on the couch, empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside him. Tommy moved through the apartment like a ghost, gathering what he needed. Dark clothes, his father's old Polaroid camera from the closet, film he'd bought yesterday with money saved from odd jobs. He left money on the kitchen table for the whiskey his father would buy tomorrow, a small act of enabling that made him sick, but seemed necessary. One more day, one more bottle, and then Tommy would figure out how to break free. He changed clothes in his room, looking at posters on walls. Yankees, Knicks, a map of the world he'd never see. Tommy caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Jaw tight with determination, eyes hard with purpose, body coiled like a weapon waiting to be deployed. Tonight, he'd be the muscle, the protection, the one who made sure Marcus and Ray could do what needed doing. Tonight, he'd prove that his anger was more than destruction, that his strength could save instead of hurt. Tommy touched the camera, checking the film, making sure it would work when everything depended on it. Then he left the apartment without looking back at his father, walking out into sunshine that felt wrong for a day that would end in darkness. Ray Tucker sat at his family's kitchen table with maps spread before him like battle plans, tracing routes with his finger, memorizing every alley and side street between here and Hunts Point. His grandmother hummed in the next room, oblivious to what her grandson was planning, focused on her crossword puzzle and her morning stories on the radio. Ray had always been the planner, the thinker, the one who saw patterns others missed. While Marcus dreamed of escape and Tommy fought his demons and Miguel tried to protect everyone, Ray watched and learned and waited for the moment when information could become power. That moment was tonight. He'd spent the last 3 days memorizing Diego's operation. The schedule, the patterns, the weaknesses. He'd convinced Carmen to betray her brother, had extracted every detail about the warehouse meeting, had planned their surveillance down to the minute. Now, he sat surrounded by hand-drawn maps, notes in his careful handwriting, a plan that depended on timing and luck, and the hope that 3 kids from the Bronx could document a drug deal and live to tell about it. Ray's hands were steady as he folded the maps, tucked them into his jacket pocket. His mind was calm, focused, running through contingencies and backup plans. But underneath the calm was something harder, something that had been building since the day Miguel shook Diego's hand and sealed his fate. A cold rage at a world that gave kids like them no good choices, that forced them to risk everything just to save a friend. He checked his watch. 10:47 a.m. 11 hours until the meeting. 11 hours to make final preparations, to coordinate with Marcus and Tommy, to steel himself for what was coming. Ray stood, stretching muscles tight with anticipation. He dressed in layers despite the heat. Dark clothes that would blend with shadows, jacket with deep pockets for maps and notes, and a small knife he hoped he wouldn't need. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone older than 17, someone who'd crossed invisible lines and couldn't go back. "Going out, Grandma," he called. "Be safe, baby." If she only knew. Ray walked through morning streets toward the meeting spot they'd agreed on, behind Sal's diner, the place where all their plans began and ended. The sun was climbing higher, heat already building, the day stretching ahead like a held breath before the plunge. Miguel Rodriguez sat on his bed watching his younger brothers sleep past dawn, their small bodies tangled in sheets, faces peaceful in dreams that didn't include warehouse meetings or heroin deliveries or the weight of impossible choices. His mother had already left for her shift at the garment factory, leaving food and a note telling him to watch his brothers, to be good, to remember she loved him. Miguel touched the note, his mother's handwriting shaky from exhaustion, and felt something crack inside his chest. She had no idea what her son had become, what he was about to do. She believed he was still the boy who played stickball and dreamed of better things. Not the one who'd spent weeks learning Diego's operation, counting blood money, preparing to cross the final line into active drug distribution. He stood, moving quietly so he wouldn't wake his brothers, and went to the kitchen. The apartment felt smaller than usual, walls closing in, air thick with August heat and the weight of the day ahead. Miguel made coffee, his mother's cheap instant, bitter and weak, and stood at the window watching the neighborhood wake up. Somewhere out there, Marcus was preparing his careful plans. Tommy was gathering equipment. Ray was memorizing maps and routes. And Carmen was getting ready too, making herself pretty for a night that would end with her running away, or with everyone Miguel loved getting hurt. Miguel thought about last night, about climbing through her window, about the way her body had felt against his, about the promises they'd made in darkness. He'd told her they'd run away together after tonight, that they'd escape Diego and start over somewhere far from the Bronx. He'd almost believed it himself. But in morning light, with his brothers sleeping and his mother's note in his pocket and Diego's threats echoing in his mind, Miguel knew the truth. There was no escape. There was only tonight, only the warehouse, only the choice between betraying Diego or betraying everyone he loved. He showered, letting water wash away the scent of Carmen's skin, the memory of freedom. He dressed in clothes Diego had bought him. Nice jeans, a button-down shirt, shoes that actually fit, the uniform of someone being groomed for a role in the organization. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a stranger, someone who'd learned to count money and keep secrets and swallow his conscience. Miguel's youngest brother stirred, called his name sleepily. "I'm here," Miguel said, going to him, smoothing his hair. "Go back to sleep." "Where you going tonight?" The question hit like a punch. "Just work. I'll be back." "Promise?" Miguel looked at his brother's trusting face and lied. "Promise." The day crawled forward, time moving like honey, each hour stretching impossibly long. Carmen finished her hair, styled it loose and pretty, sprayed it with drugstore hairspray that smelled like chemicals and false hope. She put on her yellow sundress, the one Miguel liked, and felt like she was dressing for a funeral. Marcus met Ray and Tommy behind Sal's diner at noon, the three of them going over the plan one final time. They synchronized watches, Marcus's Timex, Ray's Casio, Tommy's father's old Bulova, making sure they'd move in perfect coordination. Ray showed them the maps, traced the routes, pointed out escape paths if everything went wrong. "We get photos," Ray said, voice steady despite the stakes. "We document Diego with the drugs and the money. Then we take it to federal authorities, let them handle the rest." "And Miguel?" Tommy asked. "Miguel comes with us," Marcus said, jaw set with determination. "We're not leaving without him." They clasped hands, the three of them, a pact sealed in sweat and loyalty, and the desperate hope that friendship could be stronger than fear. Miguel spent the afternoon with his brothers, playing stickball in the street, buying them ice cream from the corner store, memorizing their laughter because he didn't know if he'd hear it again. At 4 o'clock, Carlos appeared to escort him to Diego's social club, and Miguel went without protest, without looking back, because looking back would break him. Diego was waiting, calm and confident, laying out the evening's plan. They'd leave at 9:30, arrive at the warehouse by 10. The suppliers were coming from Manhattan with the product. Miguel would watch, learn, help count money. Simple, easy. Just another step in his education. "You ready?" Diego asked. Miguel met his eyes and lied. "Yeah, I'm ready." The sun began its slow descent, painting the Bronx in shades of amber and gold, beautiful and indifferent. Carmen stood at her window, watching shadows lengthen, touching the mark on her collarbone, remembering Miguel's mouth and his promises, and the way he'd looked at her like she was worth saving. Marcus packed his bag one final time, checked his knife, reread his notes. Tommy loaded film into the camera, tested the flash, did pull-ups in Sal's basement to burn off nervous energy. Ray studied his maps until he could navigate Hunts Point blind, until every alley and loading dock was burned into his memory. And Miguel sat in Diego's back room, watching the clock tick toward 9:30, toward the warehouse, toward the moment when everything would change. He thought about his friends preparing to save him. He thought about Carmen getting ready to betray her brother. He thought about his mother and his brothers and the life he'd never have. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the sky. Tonight, they'd all whispered to themselves in their separate preparations. Tonight, everything changes. Tonight, we fight or run or die or somehow impossibly win. The city held its breath. The neighborhood watched and waited. And 4 friends and a girl who loved one of them moved toward a warehouse in Hunts Point, where the future would be decided in photographs and violence, and the desperate hope that loyalty could be stronger than fear. The sun set, the stars emerged, distant and cold.